I was into cars right from an early age, and cars apparently was the first word that I spoke, so I don't know where it came from. Nobody in my family was into cars. My dad had a really weird taste in cars, so he had things like a Renault 20, a Volvo 240, a Saab, so 99, anything that was kind of slightly offbeat he bought, so he didn't buy Cortinas and things like that. So maybe that's partly where my interest came from, because we always had something on the drive that was different to what other people had. So that sort of got me into cars, sort of got my enthusiasm going, and particularly got me into Saabs really. And he recounted this story of going across Norway in a Saab, and I was amazed by its performance on ice, and that's why I bought one, and I've been into them ever since. But my first car was a Vauxhall Viva Sport Hatch, which is basically the sloping back version, and it was like a big sort of coffin on the back of it really, and it was a lovely white colour with sport stripes and a full complement of dashboard, so it had an oil gauge and an ammeter and things like that, which of course you needed in a 1300cc car, and I took that all over the place to Scotland and just ran it into the ground basically. So when I first got a job, I had a Vauxhall Nova as the first sort of personal car I had, and it was lovely green colour with beige interior, beautiful. But then I got then I got company cars pretty much straight away, just because of what I was doing. I had a Peugeot 205, and then just a succession of Sierras and Mondeos and stuff like that. And and you went through the whole Mondeo LX, GL, blah blah blah. It was very mundane, and I found that really depressing as a day-to-day thing, because these cars were just like boxes basically. So I was kind of hankering after having something a little bit unusual, and I'd always loved Alfa Suds, and I thought I want something for the weekend, and that's really the car that sort of I went after. Although I was driving company cars, what really motivated me to start working pretty much was, how can I afford to buy an Alfa Sud? That's pretty much was my motivation, since I'd seen one when I was at university, and it was one of those cars at the time in the early 90s when nobody really wanted them. It was just an old car, an old sort of, in most people's minds, not very good hot hatch. So I managed to get one pretty cheap, and it was a pretty ropey one. It had rust all over the place. The back hatchback was hardly held onto the bodywork, but it looked fine and I loved it. So I bought that, kept it, and I thought, well, I need one that's a little bit better than that. I'll restore one, I'll get one restored. So I bought a wreck, and then had that restored. So at that time I had two, and then I decided to move house and thought, I'm not using these cars, they're just sat there on the drive, we're not really doing anything, which is a real shame, because that's not why I bought them. So I decided to sell them, both the cars, and instead of having those, I bought something that my wife would like as well, because she thought the Alfa Sud was a bit ordinary and a bit sort of boy racery, which it was. So I sort of grew up a bit and bought an Alfa Romeo Spider, and we moved out to the countryside, and so we had a kind of slightly more idyllic lifestyle. But it started to make me think, what do I really want to do with my life? I got to that sort of point in time when I thought about it, and I thought, I like classic cars. My job is marketing. I wonder if I could bring those two things together. And then I found this course about starting up a classic car hire company, and I thought, oh, that sounds fantastic. That's cars and doing this. So I looked at it and I thought, I'll go on the course, see what's involved. And I thought, no one else is hiring out an Alfa Romeo Spider. Let's get some cars that nobody else has had, that can give me a little bit of a niche to start the business. And I originally started it as a hobby, because I thought, I've got my day job, it's never going to really fill that in, but it'll give me something interesting on the side that makes up for the fact I've got to do a 9 to 5 day to day. And that's how I got going, and then I got more enthusiastic about it, and I thought, I've got an Alfa Spider, I need something else. And I had always loved the Jensen Interceptor, I just loved the shape of it. And I remember on my wedding day saying, I want to own an Interceptor. And I thought, how can I justify owning an Interceptor? And classic car hire was the most obvious way to do it. This car here, this is the Alfa Romeo Spider that started it all. So I bought this car in about 2005 to replace the Alfa Suds that I had, and this is really the car that kick-started me thinking I want to hire out classic cars, and it is still on the fleet today, and I can honestly say that this is the most reliable car that we have ever had on the fleet. So I bought it with 67,000 kilometers on it. It's done about 150,000 kilometers now, and aside from a few minor things, starter motors, clutch, things like that, it has been almost 100% reliable. Almost 100% reliable, but it is an Alfa Romeo. So I still love this car. I really don't get much chance to drive it, but it is great to see this car 10 years on, still soldering away as a classic car, hire car. So when I sort of got the idea of what the company would be like, it'd be slightly different cars, I wanted to think of a name, and I wanted something that would stand out and sort of represent kind of what it's like to have a classic car for the weekend. So that sort of inevitably took me down the sort of Steve McQueen route, and that's where Great Escape came from. I thought really what a weekend in a classic car is about that sort of getaway experience, and that's where the name came from. I thought it's got to be called Great Escape Cars, and that's what started it really. It's about being Steve McQueen for 24 hours or 48 hours. So I started the business with 2 cars. The Alfa was sort of a bit of a slow burner, but the Jensen was massively popular, and it attracted a lot of real petrol heads, people who were really enthusiastic about Jensens and really wanted to drive one. So it was great to sort of see people finally sort of realising their dream of driving one of these cars without having to own one. That really fired me up about it. So one of the first hirers was a guy who had a couple of Jaguars, and we got on really well, and he asked me if I'd like to hire out his XJS V12 convertible, and I said, yeah, that's great, that's exactly the sort of car I want to hire out. Fits into that sort of mould of being a bit different, nobody else has got one. So I did. So we had a few months of doing that, worked really well, worked for me and worked for him, and he got an income off a car that was just sat there. And so he offered me an E-Type as well, which he happened to have, so I took that on board. And I hadn't really imagined this as being the business model, but I suddenly saw a way of growing the business without having to find £250,000 to buy a load of cars. So I then started looking for other people in a similar situation who might have an unused car that they weren't really using, or wanted to buy a car and get some investment return on it. And that's really how it started to grow. So I built the business up initially that way. So got this sort of idea of growing the business through having different cars, and I started to find very quickly a great big pool of people who were prepared to offer me cars to hire out. So there was having all new cars coming, like Mark II Jaguars, Triumph Stags, Spitfires, TR6s, Porsches, a whole range of cars which I would never have got close to in a million years with what I was doing in my previous job. And it sort of fascinated me that there was this opportunity here, and not just because I could drive these cars, it wasn't so much about that. I just think when somebody had offered me a TR6, and I think, wow, what can I do with this? How much can I get out of this, and who can I attract into it? So I really appreciated the challenge of it, and I was really driven by it. Not so much ambition to be this sort of great company, but just because I was really enthusiastic about the opportunities that were coming along. And I suddenly sort of found within about 2 years I had about 25-30 cars just by sort of luck, really, and it made me the biggest classic car hire company in the UK. And that wasn't my objective, but it just sort of suddenly was a position I was in, and it had a whole lot of issues around that, because suddenly I was managing a part-time business with all of these cars while also holding down a 9-to-5 job and answering phones and dealing with problems while also trying to run a business on my own. I had a little bit of part-time help at weekends, so it was turning out very tiring, sort of working 5 days a week, evenings as well as weekends, and I did that for a couple of years, and it got to a point where something's got to change, really. So there was a lot of issues coming up which were new to me, and I didn't necessarily have time to deal with, so that was frustrating. Alongside that, my job was becoming really more and more frustrating and unpleasant and unenjoyable, and just meetings and just dealing with sort of people that I didn't really want to deal with, and being in environments I didn't want to be with. So that was going on. Alongside that, underneath, the economic crash happened, and working in the construction industry, that was an interesting time. So this is one of the latest cars we've added to the fleet, and it happens to be one of the cars that we lease in, so a guy owns it, and then we provide an income for it, and it's a Series 2 4.2 E-Type, and it is absolutely fantastic. I mean, this car, it is original colour, and it just looks, I've never seen an E-Type look as good as it does in this colour. It's just absolutely fantastic. So we've got 3 of these. We've got a V12 as well, a coupe, and also a convertible as well. But E-Type's just the kind of car that people love driving. It's never going to fade. So things were getting difficult with the business sort of growing, and there's all these sort of issues within the company that I worked for, and I felt like I had sort of feet on two different rafts and I was just being gradually pulled apart, and that something had to happen. And as fate would have it, something did happen. I was made redundant. So I had the phone call, I had the meeting, and unlike a lot of people who would have sort of banged the table and sort of got really annoyed about it, I was sort of secretly pretty pleased, really. I thought, God, I finally got the chance to get out of this place and get out of this drudgery and do something that I really want to do. Because without that impetus, without having been made redundant, it's very difficult to say, today is the day that I'm going to take that massive leap and put everything at risk. So I had the decision made for me, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I can honestly say that day should be in lights in my life. Yeah. This is a bit of an extreme here, really. So we got a Morris Minor convertible. This is one of the first cars I bought when I started to expand the fleet, and it had to be white and it had to be red interior because we wanted to get to the wedding market. And this car is it's been a real trooper, really. So the car has just gone on and on and on. And the great thing about it, from our point of view, is how simple it is to maintain. So stuff goes wrong, but there isn't that much to go wrong with it, really. And when it goes wrong, it's a relatively easy fix. So there's really easy to get hold of the parts, and they're not that expensive. So it is a real trooper, this car. And it's one of those cars that it doesn't fit with modern life. It's really slow, it's really basic, but people just love going out in it, really. And people probably get as much enjoyment out of that as they do out of something like this, because it really steps you back in life a little bit. As the sort of business grew, a lot of those cars were belonging to owners. And what I found was that I sort of felt at times increasingly that I was sort of an employee of these owners, that I was sort of there, just a money-making machine to service their needs. And I thought, hang on a minute, you know, is that really what I want? Do I want to be beholden to other people? But I couldn't go out and spend a lot of money on the car. So what I did is I tended to go out and buy a car that needed work done on it, put it through the workshop, and then end up out of the sausage machine with a much better value car. And that's what I started to do. But I made a lot of mistakes along the way, because the business was set up on having eclectic cars, things like the Jensen Interceptor, and that were a bit different, that would sort of separate me from the mainstream of the classic car hire business, because I was thinking everyone's got MGs, everyone's got, you know, Jaguar Mark IIs. I don't want to do that. I want to have something that only I've got. And I also, I'll be brutally honest, sort of indulged my wish list of classic cars that I wanted to buy. So I think I kind of justified it to myself because I wanted something different. So I ended up with working my way through various cars, and some of them were real hit and miss. So the Jensen was obviously a real hit, and then I bought a Porsche 928, which was a real miss. You know, it's one of those cars you think that's a sleeper. Someone's going to want to drive that, like an XJS, and it was a total miss. And similarly with the Rover SD1 Vitesse, you think, wow, that's a real Q car of the 80s, but nobody wanted to hire it, and it kept breaking down. This is quite an unusual car that we've got in the corner here. This is a Renault Caravelle, and we've been using this for filming. It's not a very popular car with the presenters because it's quite a hard car to drive. It's rear-engined, but it's sort of typical of the kind of cars we find to film with. So the film companies want unusual stuff, so we go out and try and find something that's unusual, like the Caravelle, that will look quite good on camera. And the fact that it's not that easy to drive or is not that great to drive is really not a major factor in it. It's just the fact it's unusual. And I really like this because this starts to indulge my kind of interest in unusual cars, really, whereas things like the Minor and the E-Type, fantastic, but they're pretty mainstream. Something like this, it's great to sort of get the task of finding something unusual and a bit offbeat, and then you come up with something like this. As the business started to grow, I got a phone call out of the blue from a production company working for the BBC for this new program called Antiques Road Trip, which was in its first series, and they wanted one of our cars very last minute. They needed it for the following week to use over a series of weeks to film this program. So we provided this car, a Jaguar XJS convertible, in the first year, and then in the second year they came back and had a couple more cars, and they were sourcing cars from lots of different people at that time. And then as the time went on, that side of the business really started to grow. So we not only were doing Antiques Road Trip, but we were getting approached by OK Magazine and by the Brit Awards to provide cars for these different events, and you sort of couldn't really tell what the phone was going to be next. You know, one minute it's Paloma Faith, Brit Awards, the next minute it's, you know, Antiques Road Trip or OK Hello Magazine. You weren't quite sure. And that's what I really liked about it, and particularly on the Antiques Road Trip side, I thought, I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to solely provide these cars to this program, and it turned out that there was. So I, as the sort of time progressed, I invested in trailers and trucks to enable us to move cars anywhere, and that's really what started that side of the business really. So I brought on staff dedicated to moving these cars around. That changed the business. So I was sort of getting into something that was completely new to me, but something that had to be done to a very high standard. So it's one of the things that I didn't appreciate, and perhaps some people that don't hire out cars don't appreciate, is how hard these cars work. So between sort of April and October in a year, they can do 10 or 15,000 miles, so they're constantly being used, and that puts them at risk. So there have been some memorable occasions when the cars have come back not quite in the same way they were when they went out. So for instance, I had an E-Type that went out. The guy brought it back on time. I saw it sort of pulling into the yard, pulling along. The guy was smiling, everything looked fine, car sounded fine, and he pulled in, got out the car, and I said, "How was everything, sir?" He said, "Well, I've had a little bit of a bump." And I said, "Well, that's fine, I'm sure we can sort it out." So he took me around to the back of the car, which was not visible at all from the front of the car. This was an E-Type V12, and the back of the car was 1.5 feet shorter than it should have been. So whatever had gone into the back of it had cut the boot space by 1.5 feet, and I'll never get over the shock of seeing that. So this Saab is a good example of the kind of car that I put on because I'm interested in Saabs and like Saabs and think other people will be, but as it turns out, not many other people actually are. So I bought this Saab, this one, and I've got a red one as well, to put on hire because I thought people would love them. A few people hired them out, but it didn't really work. And I also found that because I love these cars, that hiring them out to other people sort of felt like sharing as sort of something that I wanted to be mine. So I took them off the fleet, and we use these now. This one as a promo vehicle for the business, so it goes out on some of our rallies, but that's pretty much it really. One of the sort of weird things about running this business is I got into it because I absolutely love classic cars, and I wanted a Jensen Interceptor, and I wanted to get some use out of the Alpha Spider. I went through a process, like I said, a sort of like a kid in a sweet shop and buying the stuff that I really loved. But what I kind of started to realise after a while, it's a little bit like being a kid in a sweet shop. You know, eventually you get a little bit sugar overdose really, and it has to become a little bit different to it. It has to be a business. You can't just indulge your passion and your interest in cars. It has to be something more than that. So what has started to happen is the fleet consists of cars largely now which I like, but I wouldn't necessarily go out and buy as my weekend car, because these are the cars that people want to hire. And the other aspect is that when I buy these cars now, I don't have an emotional bond with them, and that's really important. It might sound really hard-hearted, but it's really important, because if you are emotionally bonded to the car, it becomes even harder to hire it out at the weekend. It affects the decisions you make, all of those things, and that car has to be a working asset basically for the business, and I have to think of it that way, and that is essentially how I think of it now. I would really like to have an ISO Griffo on the fleet, because I just love them. Something like that, or a Monteverde, something like that, something that's really unusual. There's sort of classic 60s Maseratis that I'd like as well. And I hate to say it, but it would be nice to have a Ferrari 328, and it would have to be red as well. And I might take it out in the dark rather than the daylight, but that would be a nice car to have. So there's definitely cars out there, but those cars just are not viable to hire out. They're really out there in the ether, so they're never going to be on the fleet. I mean, even a 328 is out of reach now in terms of being able to hire it out, because it's too unreliable. So I still have those cars, and they're still, most of them are the offbeat stuff, but definitely an ISO Griffo would be top of my list. And I kicked myself really, because we had an ISO Griffo for filming this year, and I wasn't in a position to be able to go out with it when it was out filming. Otherwise I'd have been able to knock that off my bucket list. The real high of it is being your own boss, really. I mean, it's changed dramatically from what I imagined I would be doing when I first started. I imagined this as sort of, you know, you'd be pretty flexible on the time that you worked, you could work to your own agenda, all of those things, and it's not that at all. It's much more regimented and much more structured and a bit more 9 to 5 than it was, and I'm doing stuff and getting involved in stuff I never imagined I'd get involved in. But I just love the challenge of it. I love the fact that something new comes along and we can think about how we make that successful and make it work, and that's what really drives me. And I will say I love the customers, really. That some of them may be difficult to deal with, and some of them don't get classic cars, but the ones that really get it, the ones that come on our road trips in particular, are an absolute joy to deal with. The enthusiasm, the change that you see in them in that space of 8 hours is really rewarding. There are downsides, as you can probably imagine. I think the downsides are it's very, very stressful getting a business off the ground and growing it. That's a lot of sleepless nights involved in that, and you wouldn't, I think anybody setting up a business should really think about that hard before they get into it, because it is a lot harder than you imagine it will be. And along the way I've learned a lot of lessons. I've learned to work with people that I really trust, and the team that I've got around me now are people that I really enjoy working with and that I trust and that share my passion for it, and that's absolutely critical for me, but it's taken a while to get there. Yeah.